It's the 6th of June. In 1944, we're in a landing craft pitching violently in the icy chop of the English Channel. And an American private named Thomas Miller is doing his best to stay sane as he's repeatedly tormented by the rhythmic clang of the ramp, which echoes through the steel hull with a menacing consistency. In normal times, this routine sound, which marks the passage of time, would be mere background noise. But these are not normal times. Miller and his comrades are seasick, soaked, terrified, and vulnerable. With all this on their plate, the clanging of the ramp is enough to drive the men mad. One of his comrades starts dry heaving into his helmet before the acidic bile crumbles onto his already soaked uniform. Another believes he is back at home and finds himself locked in a desperate whispered prayer with the soldier next to him. The chattering of teeth and the shiver of cold would usually be enough to give away their position. After all, the enemy is only a few hundred meters away. But thanks to the noisy clang of the ramp, they won't be heard. Not yet, at least. See, this clanging isn't coming from a broken hinge in the boat or from a bell tower on the shore. Instead, it's coming from a series of heavy rounds that the enemy have installed all along the bluffs. Although a cryptic message to us, for the soldiers trapped inside the landing craft. The meaning could not be clearer. Time is running out. It's been only a few agonizing minutes since the boats started their final approach. But by now it's already become one of the bloodiest assaults in human history. And it's about to get far worse for the American invaders. It's a fight which has already claimed thousands of lives in some of the most unbelievably brutal and tragically swift ways possible. Some quietly drown after being thrown from their craft. Others are murdered savagely, shredded to death by machine gun fire in the churning surf under the smoky sky. None of this is lost on Miller, who now ponders the last few minutes of horror as he's tormented by the monotonous clang, second by second. But to make certain that the message is fully driven home, the clanging of the ramp is interrupted every couple of minutes, and a voice rings through the chaos to taunt Miller and his frozen comrades. Your Fuhrer has abandoned you. Every 7 seconds, an American soldier dies on Omaha. Retreat now. This is the story of D-Day's darkest hours. On the 6th of June, 1944, the Allied forces launched Operation Overlord, an enormous invasion into German-occupied France with the intention of completely knocking the Third Reich off the map. The plan was to establish a vast Western European front for the Allies to occupy. This would allow them unprecedented access to the heart of Germany, but most importantly, a direct path to Berlin with which to feed their ravenous war machine. Adolf Hitler and the Allied leaders had actually been locked in a brutal war for years, so the invasion itself, while anticipated, was a tremendous shock to the German High Commander, an advantage that the Allies were hoping to press home in order to wrap up the fight, before the Germans had a chance to get their act together. To quote General Eisenhower directly, "You only have to kick in the door and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." And if you were watching from the sidelines, the opening events seemed to prove the Allies right. The further the forces pushed into France, the more the German resistance withered away. And countless civilians suddenly found themselves liberated by a foreign force which considered them allies. Tens of thousands of civilians cheered their liberators, and those behind the line on the Allied side suddenly began to harden their resolve in response to the anticipation. Despite the astounding progress right out of the gate, by late morning, the Allied war machine had begun to grind to a halt. Even though the Americans had managed to land on the outskirts of the beachhead, the entrenched German defenses had choked the offensive to a standstill, and a German counteroffensive would send the American vanguard packing. It was the first major setback the Americans faced during the invasion, and it would be this bloody nose which sets the stage for the most brutal hours in human history. The historian Anthony Beevor writes that it was the first moment the myth of an easy landing was shattered. Bruised as they may have been, though, they were by no means ready to give up. While spending the morning consolidating their positions in the surf-soaked territories, the Americans began planning a new push for the afternoon, in which they would abandon their plan to simply storm the bluffs and instead try to flank the German positions so that they could clear the supply of German munitions into the strongholds, and at the same time take control of the escape routes from the beach. If successful, it would massively strengthen America's hand, whilst in the same move massively weaken Germany's and severely diminish her chances of ever launching a successful counteroffensive. The stakes were high. To quote General Omar Bradley directly, "If I do not get a breakthrough at Omaha, then I must call off this invasion." And to the commander's relief, the American push had been an enormous struggle. The bluffs were looking very much within reach, but by mid-morning, they found themselves dealing with some rather tenacious resistance from the German defenders dug into the overlooking bluffs. Although it held pretty minor strategic value once the name of the beach came across Hitler's desk, he immediately saw it as a primary target. After all, holding a beach named in such an imposing way would be quite the propaganda win. Hundreds of thousands of men would soon pay for this hubris in blood. To quote the historian Richard Overy, strategically, Omaha was a secondary objective, not a primary one. But once the name was invoked, it assumed mythic proportions. Or to use the words of Alan Clark, the beach itself had no intrinsic value that justified the lives lost for it, but the psychological stakes were immense. And so, on the 6th of June, Hitler intervened in the war plans and ordered that Omaha must be held. Command of this crucial task was given to General Marx, who headed the German 352nd Infantry Division. Hours later, on the 6th, the Allies responded in turn and issued orders to push forward, most famously known by their slogan, "Full speed ahead." As a result, any Allied forces retreating without permission from command will be punished. And over the coming hours, as many as thousands of soldiers will be killed for the crime of hesitation. With this, Omaha, which should have been just a peripheral tactical objective, is about to become the turning point in the invasion, as both Hitler and the Allied High Command allow their egos to cloud their strategic vision. During early and mid-morning, the fight kicks off, and both sides suffer heavy losses as the Americans try to slam through the German lines with devastating infantry assaults, and the Germans forced to hold their ground on pain of death. Absorb one punishing salvo after another, all the while refusing to budge. By late morning, the Allied commanders are losing their patience, and they order a prolonged and quite frankly unprecedented naval bombardment on the beach. To use their own words, Omaha must be cleared from the face of the earth. It must cease to exist. We'll rub it out completely. And so on the 6th of June, the bombardment begins, and over the coming hours, the Allied warships will drop thousands of tons of explosives on the beach, utterly leveling the infrastructure below. The defenses on Omaha are reduced to rubble and lacking the power to challenge the seas below the bluffs. The Germans are simply forced to sit and wait as the destruction rains down onto the beach below. As if to make matters even worse, Eisenhower had decreed that the landing must continue since the American forces would be more likely to put up a good fight for a clear beachhead than they would for a fortified strongpoint. Tens of thousands of people are now trapped between the American hammer and the German anvil. Once the Allied naval bombardments come into full swing, the true horror begins to unfold. Soldiers are crushed alive under fallen debris, slammed into walls by shockwaves, roasted alive in firestorms, or suffocated as their lungs are crushed by the compression blast from explosives. A German medic named Hans Richter would later recall, "The beach burned like a torch. The bombs sucked the oxygen from the air. We couldn't breathe." Between thousands to tens of thousands of people, mostly soldiers, perish in the initial assault, but it all serves a purpose. Now that the defenses have been softened up, the Americans can start to make a push onto the beach itself. And on the 6th of June, they press inwards with brutal efficiency, chasing the German defenders out of every pocket they try to hold on to. German casualties are astounding, but it won't be that easy. Behind the scenes, an experienced general named Bradley takes the reins for the assault on Omaha. And he has a few ideas on how to turn the tide. Whereas others might see the utter destruction of an entire beach as a tremendous strategic loss, Bradley sees the chaos as a tactical advantage. See, the Germans like to fight by using their fortifications, machine guns, and artillery in order to obliterate whichever target dares to stand in front of them. Bradley realizes he can use the rubble to deny them this advantage of overwhelming firepower. He gives his troops the order to hug the bluffs, stay close enough to the enemy, and they won't be able to call in those fireworks, because they'll be in harm's way themselves. But how close is close enough? It's said that they should be no more than a rifle's throw away. With this order, the battle turns from a set-piece showdown between two mechanized armies into an absolutely brutal slog. Bunker by bunker, trench by trench, pillbox by pillbox. A war correspondent named Ernie Pyle would go on to call it the most savage beach assault in human history. Tanks become useless in the thick rubble, heavy machine guns lose their tactical advantage without a clear field of fire, and even every day, small arms like rifles with fixed bayonets become too clunky to fit through tight passages and ruin fortifications. Instead, pistols, knives, shovels, and grenades become the preferred tools for fighting men scrapped day and night, often with their enemy in the next trench of the same strong point. Engagements were random, arbitrary, unpredictable, with no front lines or set formations. One particularly terrifying weapon became the flamethrower, which was used to preemptively singe any bunker, trench, tunnel, or hiding spot that was suspected to contain hidden enemies. Men were roasted alive as flames spat death into every corner. Soldiers reported that any enemy carrying this terrifying weapon became an immediate priority target. Sniping also became a go-to tactic, denying the men the opportunity to ever let their guard down. Those fetching water or carrying ammunition were routinely struck down to deny their comrades resupply in the heat of battle. To quote Anthony Beaver again, soldiers fought bunker by bunker, trench by trench. Pillboxes were stormed with grenades. A single strong point could change hands 4 times in a single hour. It wasn't even war anymore. It was primitive hatred fought with knives, spades, and bare hands. There was no front line on Omaha, only overlapping zones of death. It would go on like this for hours, and the beach itself turns into a meat grinder as both sides desperately try to muster new troops to send into the ruins. By late morning, the average life expectancy for a soldier on Omaha is minutes. Lieutenant Colonel Ludwig Renn of the Wehrmacht said that the beach is no longer measured by meters but by corpses. Another American soldier wrote in a private letter home that the wounded lay in the sand with their entrails exposed, calling for their mothers. On the German side, a soldier would write that there were bodies lying in bunkers, frozen in grotesque positions. Sometimes you'd step over a man with his innards spilled out and his eyes frozen open in a few steps. Later, there'd be a girl with half her head gone leaning against a burnt wall, like she was just resting. And while all of this is going on above the bluffs, there was an entire campaign of brutal violence taking place underground in the tunnels. Groups of men would crawl silently in the pitch black, only to turn a corner and find another platoon doing the same. Screams of panic would ensue as soldiers scrambled over one another to bludgeon their enemies before they were extinguished themselves. Those that fell half dead would be trampled in the dust of the tunnels as their comrades fought tooth and nail for survival and desperate. Frenzied melees interrupted by spiteful bursts of machine gun fire, which resolved the dispute and left only the screams of the wounded. The Americans would go on to call it the hell on earth. The German veteran Otto Schmidt remembers we had to take tunnels and bunkers. One time I climbed into a tunnel and found it already occupied by an American with a shovel. We fought in total darkness. One particularly costly engagement would go on to be immortalized as Bloody Omaha, a stretch of beach that the Americans had managed to land on in early morning. Once there, a captain named John Miller then oversaw a harrowing struggle against the German defenders and managed to cling on through hours of some of the most intense fighting on earth with just a handful of men. Bradley would go on to joke that the Germans lost more men trying to hold this one stretch of beach than they did on the entirety of the fight against the British. But while the two armies slog it out in some of the most savagely violent fighting ever seen in human history, the civilians still alive in the nearby towns are trapped between the invisible front line under constant threat of a stray grenade or shell tearing them apart. And After hours of ducking and weaving between firefights, they're starting to succumb to terror. One of the civilian survivors, Colette Dubois, was only a teenager during the ordeal. She remembers, "We hid in cellars. We drank rainwater. I saw a boy shot for trying to reach his house. People disappeared when they went for cover. Shells would fall, and the house would be gone, just blood and mist. Savage beyond belief." As all this was, though, Bradley's plan had worked. Hugging the bluffs had denied them their advantage in firepower, and the Americans had bought themselves some much-needed time. By late morning, the Allies launched renewed assaults. It was a massive push from all sides on the German forces, just inland from Omaha. The plan was to completely break the main resistance on the beach, and it worked. Within hours, the American groups linked up, and now the German defenders were caught in the snare. This would have been a death sentence, as the Allied air power started to set its claws into the trapped soldiers. Without the ability to receive fresh supplies, they would begin to perish from attrition and disease, and would be unable to resist any American attacks as their ammunition dwindled. Marx, the general in command of the German forces inside the entanglement, had actually begged Hitler for permission to retreat hours earlier, the moment that the invasion had begun, but he was told to stay and fight. Over the coming hours, Marx will continue to appeal to his Führer and try to convince him of the hopelessness of staying in this encircled position as the Allied onslaught sweeps through Omaha and the men now trapped within it. He would go on to write that it was not a battle, it was a nightmare of fire and steel. Men went mad. We were encircled not just by the Americans, but by the silence of death. The trap that the Germans were encircled within became known as the killing zone, an area around a few kilometers wide, and a few kilometers deep surrounding the ruins of the beach. It was here that things would go from bad to worse. By afternoon, the pressure mounted to an unbearable degree, and since they were encircled, they were unable to access any reinforcements. Shell shock and exhaustion became regular fixtures. A German medic would recall that the wounded screamed until their throats were raw, then they just stared. What was left inside the killing zone wasn't really an army anymore. It was a collection of trapped, desperate, and hopeless men, armed with whatever weapons and ammo was left, frantically trying to scrape together enough to survive whilst avoiding being picked off by the Allied forces laying in wait on the edges. Caloric intake dwindled to nothing, forced to stay under cover for fear of artillery fire. Soldiers were left with no option but to relieve themselves in the bunkers and trenches that they were hiding in. As a consequence, dysentery and typhus ripped through the survivors with merciless results. Behind the front line, half-hearted plans are put together either to break the encirclement with reinforcements or to airlift Mark's fresh supplies in order to give his trapped soldiers just enough food and ammo to keep up the fight. None of these plans bear fruit, and those inside the killing zone are left to fend for themselves, some tens of thousands of men. Morning came and went, then afternoon, then dusk, and by nightfall, the jig was up. And so we find ourselves back in the shell-scarred, corpse-strewn beach, which would be drowned in hopeless silence if not for the distant clang of a victorious landing craft. Suicidal men that had exhausted their ammunition were seen picking through the sand in search for stray bullets, fighting against the stubborn shingle, with frostbitten hands tearing inside. Gloves stolen from corpses just for the chance to find a bullet with which to shoot themselves through the head and escape the horror. Others, deliriously hungry and half-mad, were found eating dirt or wandering around in a daze, obliviously vulnerable and out in the open. General Marx sees this and comes to the grim realization that he is no longer able to keep control over what was left of his men. He told Hitler that his army was a spent force and that retreat was inevitable. To be honest, it would be inaccurate to call what Marx had an army. In reality, it was a desperate mob. But Hitler was unmoved and told Marx to fight to the last. With this final order, he gave Marx a promotion to General of the Infantry hours earlier. It was not an act of encouragement or approval. It was a subtle order. No general had ever surrendered to the enemy in German history, and Marx, now a general himself, was expected to continue this legacy and fight to the death or die by his own hand. His response was one of complete defiance. "I have no intention of shooting myself for that Bavarian corporal." With this, he made his decision, And the next day, on June the 7th, he was killed trying to escape with his forces from the Allied forces. When Mark's body was actually found by Allied troops, they found him lying in complete silence, dazed and expressionless, in a filthy, freezing trench, surrounded by exhausted and wounded staff. An American officer later recalled, "He looked like a living corpse, euro pale, unshaven, broken. He didn't even stir when we entered." But it wasn't just the newly promoted general who was in bad shape. Of the thousands of men that had originally been trapped inside the German strongholds, only a fraction were still alive by the time of the breakthrough. The other thousands had been killed, starved, frozen, or had quietly succumbed to the ravages of disease. And of the few thousand men that did live to retreat, only around a small percentage ever made it back to Germany alive. The rest would perish in brutal Allied captivity. The human cost was unimaginable for both sides, and it remains one of the bloodiest beach assaults in human history. But Omaha also marks the turning point of the Second World War in Europe, and from this moment onwards, Germany will find itself on the defensive as the Allied armies grind towards Berlin. The final death count for the battle would be between 2,500 to 5,000 individuals. Forced to fight and die in the sand, all in the name of hubris and ego,